first couple of iterations of data aggregators and caching services in order to display this stuff.
Caching's a really hard problem.
Yeah, but I took down like our production database once just because my
All right, I definitely want to dive into this because
yeah.
I think this is like probably one of the greatest fears of like probably
Totally, because
not let alone like any junior developer, but any developer. Like,
yeah.
like maybe talk to me about like how did your organization because it's one thing for you to do it, but like there's a whole organizational impact that rolls out from that.
Hey everyone, I'm just here to let you know I had a few technical difficulties with this particular interview with internet connectivity and having to restart things a lot. I've tried to do my best to get all those things ironed out in post-production, so I apologize if it seems a little disconnected at times, but I think all in all, everything turned out pretty well. Thanks for your patience. Welcome back, everybody. Today I have Rahim. He's a software engineer working at Monstercat, an independent record label. He graduated from a coding bootcamp at the end of 2015, where he went straight on to work on FIFA 2017 at EA Sports. Following that up, he moved into fintech, integrating with legacy banking systems, and then straight into another interesting field of big data, working in the e-com space. How's it going, Rahim?
It's going good. Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Yeah, no, it's great, man. It's great to see you. It's been a while, so since the strange times we live in, but it's really good to catch up with you again.
Absolutely.
Nice. So first thing that comes to mind is, and I think is kind of unique about your story, is that you were able to go straight from a boot camp, which was web focused,
yep,
and land on the FIFA team for the 2017 release at EA Sports. So how did you finagle your way into that?
So like that was a kind of like a two-tier thing. A bit of it was an intro, right? Like I knew someone working on the FIFA dev team, and they reached out to me saying that they were like expanding their skill games team. So this is a mix of production and game development. So it wasn't like a full-on game developer role, but it was a bit of a mix, and they required some technical skills where a bootcamp grad would have just fit that niche spot. So it just honestly was dumb luck that the opportunity presented itself. But then I went through the interview process, which was more technical, and that was about how you thought about problems and whether you could actually build out software. And through that process and through that interview is how I actually ended up landing the job. And I started that one like right after boot camp. It was really interesting. Like, so I'd say it was putting myself out of a comfort zone because I honestly had serious imposter syndrome applying for that job. Like, I didn't think I could work at EA like right out of a boot camp, but it was possible. And also then the second factor, which is technical thinking, the fact that they were able to suss out that I was able to understand software and build into it and learn, like that was the most important thing.
Nice. And knowing you didn't really have a strong technical background before you did the boot camp, though. It's not like you had some kind of computer science or previous programming experience, right? What were you doing before before you went to the boot camp?
Yeah, so my bachelor's degree was in economics, and then I was doing sales. So I was like selling digital advertising. So I was the farthest thing away from being a technical expert or technical at all. But I'd been exposed to computers my entire life. My dad worked in the software field. Like things just kind of clicked and made sense to me when I moved into web development and software development in general. So yeah, I was not technical, but I was able to grasp technical concepts, and that's what helped me through my job at EA.
I think you kind of touched on something interesting when you described how you got there, is that I think a lot of people assume that there wouldn't be roles that are suitable for juniors on a project like that. But what you're saying is that they've designed their workflow that it's like, it doesn't like, it's kind of it wouldn't make sense for them to put senior resources on it. So they do actually have it because of how they've like designed their workflow.
Yeah, it's that's kind of true. So yeah, like they wouldn't want to put seniors on it because, well, their most experienced developers are going into like the actual game mechanics and how the game's being built out. And I mean, now we're going into like the actual game development section, but you'd have the different teams working on mechanics or like UI integrations and stuff like that. The specific domain I was working in, which was skill game development, it was using in-house IDEs and in-house like sandboxes that they built themselves. So kind of you're put into a scripting environment that all these like really legit engineers have built. So it's like getting onto a bicycle with like, like onto a tricycle, sorry. It's like you got the training wheels on and a really solid team to help you like understand what their software development process is, how to contribute, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you're not touching any of like the serious mechanics that go into the game. That's something that you would eventually build up towards. But for this specific role that I was in, yeah, it didn't matter that I was a junior because previously they had non-technical people in this role building out the scripts for the game, and it ended up just being really nasty because they wouldn't understand how to like organize code well, or even uh, write dry code, right? So you'd have these crazy 2,000 line scripts that are dictating how a 3-minute mini game is being played. Whereas once we got onto it, we started building out like procedural mini games and building them out in a way that was actually scalable so that it could be used in multiple parts of the game.
So it's kind of interesting there. So when you started at a company like EA, and I would imagine that it depends on what product team you're on, how this ends up rolling out, but how well supported were you with like the onboarding and getting up to speed with this technology? Because it's one of the things I know, depending how early stage a company is that it's a junior out of a boot camp may start at, is there's not always a lot of support for them, and there's not necessarily a senior or any of these things. But I would have thought that a team, a product, a project as big as FIFA would have a pretty big team, so they must have to have some kind of at least reasonable onboarding. Like how was that for you?
Yeah, so the onboarding was really good. But the onboarding was good, not so much because like the resources are always available, but it's just because of how the gaming cycle works, right? You kind of crunch towards the end where you're closer to delivery, but before delivery, when the game is still being kind of like built out, its core and fundamentals are being decided and designed, there's some capacity there with the engineering team. And that's like the creative time. So that's where people are like doing mock-ups or drawing the designs on what, like for us as an example, when we were building out the skill games, that entire period was like less involved in code and more involved in like actual game design or thinking about the problems and how we could create games that fit into like how we can create games that were new enough from what FIFA has been doing like year after year after year, and still entertaining enough to like have repeat usage, because these are training games within the game, right? Like the main game is what people come there to play. So like just saying that this small facet had so many resources being dedicated towards it that like onboarding was not an issue. There was always someone for me to talk to. And like I said, in the beginning, it was more creative, less technical. And then you kind of ramp up into the more technical aspects as the development cycle goes on.
So yeah, that's super interesting. Well, we might move on now to talk about some of how your career evolved from there. So once you sort of wrapped up at EA Sports, you moved into more traditional web development roles. Um, Sort of two parts of that. Like one, like how did you find that transition, like the contrast between the two work environments? Probably talk about that, and then also, yeah, let's just start there. Like, how did you find that, like going from like a game development to web development again?
Yeah. So again, this is an interesting thing, but what I found about me personally is I love like the drastic changes. Like that's how I operate at my peak. Like where I'm learning something new is how I move faster. But that transition, first of all, the reason that it happened was I actually really enjoyed my time at EA, but it was a 9-month contract. And when that was up and it came time to renew, I just couldn't see myself like building skill games for like 9 more months. I wanted to use some of the chops that I picked up in university and some of those econ skills and some of those like, finance skills that I thought I had. Right. So the transition to Lendesk, it was really smooth. And I think for me personally, like onboarding and getting into web development was really nice because, or into the fintech company, was because it was a small team of like dedicated devs who are all really smart people and were able to like teach me all facets of web development. To go back to like how it actually felt and how that like that intense shift felt for me was, it was a bit overwhelming for, let's say, the first couple of days. But then once I realized that the team had resources for me to train me and help me get to the place where I'd be like a productive member of the dev team. Um, that was like enough for me to just kind of like let go of all of that pressure and just start focusing on the building and the learning. And I actually had a really great mentor the first like on my first project. He was a senior front end developer at the time, and he walked me through everything in the React project, which I'd never worked on before. Was giving me little tasks on debugging these Redux forms, and he was like so great at just finding the right things to make me work on to understand a React or a Redux project that I think that helped me ramp up and be a productive developer way faster.
So when you started out there, you were primarily on the front end, like you weren't kind of working across the entire stack. It's like so you went from, a narrow section within one project, sort of, cutting your teeth. So it's like small baby steps. And then you've moved into the world of web development, and you haven't been thrown kind of in the deep end where you're expected to sort of, be, effective in all areas. You kind of just started at the front end. And did you stay there? Like how long or did you move to other parts of the stack?
So I actually stayed there for about 6 months. There was some like I would get some exposure to the back end, but mostly via API connections, not like actually coding out any business logic into the API service. What I ended up doing was working more on the client service, and actually I liked that as an approach for myself personally because uh, there's something about working on UI. It's like instantly gratifying. Like you see the results of your code right there, right away. So for me, as someone who is like getting more like familiar and comfortable coding personally, that helped a lot because I was able to kind of just, fuck around with a variable and see what happens on the screen. And it just clicked a little bit faster.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, there's the messiness of JavaScript world, but I will say this, that front end project was one of the best organized front end projects I've worked on. And that's because it was like the person who did the initial boilerplate and decided on all of the conventions had a really good idea of where they wanted the software to go. Right. So I worked on that for 6 months and then eventually start getting bored, right? Like that's the thing. Once you've been doing something for a while and the technical problems aren't challenging enough, I start getting bored personally, and I wanted to move on to more API work. And yeah, there was a lot of really interesting API projects within that company that I was able to get my hands on.
Nice. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Like I really enjoy that rapid feedback of the front end. But alternatively, like when I solve certain problems on the back end, the buzz I get is like I am like a genius for solving this. Like you feel like you're like the master of the universe. Quickly humbled normally, but like it's like, there's definitely some pretty I think there's equally difficult and challenging problems on the front end as you kind of start to work in all the areas. You realize that one's not easier than the other. But I felt I seemed to encounter more of those like, I can't believe I solved this problem on the back end more than I did the front end. Day to day seems to be pretty like, especially in React, just get this component, get that. Like, once you've got like a pretty good component library, the challenges kind of like taper off.
Absolutely. And I think like where I've seen front end focused developers shine, it's not in just churning out components and UI. It's like it's the people who think about the software as software and not just UI elements. The people who are like trying to improve how the UI compiles, working on ensuring package sizes are maintained correctly, looking into newer ways of like speeding up the actual experience for users. Like that's like where I feel like the nuance in front end comes in, and that's the harder part. And it's not the part that I personally wanted to focus on, and I think that's why like API development or backend development ended up being something that I wanted to drive into more and focus on.
And then you were, as far as I remember, involved in a project that you had to integrate with like a pretty old legacy system, correct?
Yeah.
So
well, I've been on a few of these now. But yeah.
So this is like, and I've had to do a little bit of, of this of myself from time to time, but it's one of those interesting things when you come through a boot camp, you're generally exposed to like a lot of shiny new things.
Yeah.
and you're not well exposed to the history of the software world and technologies that are available to you. So it's very it's a very unique experience in terms of like how it affects your fundamentals when you have to start dealing with legacy. How did you find all that stuff?
Um, so actually, it comes from like a dealing with legacy systems is fine when you have the time and capacity to think through how you want to work with them and how you want to build, let's say, even middleware or layers in between the legacy systems that kind of make them easier to understand, or even closer to what you personally think that that system should look like. But when you don't have time, and this is what ends up being the common, like what ends up happening more often than not, is that you're on a crunch. There are deadlines to integrating with legacy systems. So for us, and it was a trap that we ended up in. We ended up, I think, building too fast and not actually thinking about the problem. So we just start throwing a service on top of the legacy system to just be able to submit applications to them. So um, here's an example of one of the legacy systems. A lot of the ways the banks accept applications or ingest data is via SOAP services. We were an entirely Ruby on Rails shop, and Ruby doesn't do SOAP well. There are plugins, there are different libraries you can use, but we kind of just
Would you say that Ruby doesn't do SOAP well, or Rails is
Sorry, Ruby. Yeah, you're right. My bad. I'm gonna conflate the two sometimes. Just bear with me. I'm
Yeah,
like not the best at that. But yeah, Ruby on Rails was not the best for like a sub service. But we kind of like
it
just
definitely leans its opinion towards
yes,
JSON.
yes. So we just needed to get something to work, right? So we kind of manually built it out, which is I don't recommend that at all. But we just needed this done so that we could get the integration going quickly. And that's that kind of trap, right? Like the speed of managing business expectations versus what you'd really like to build. So like in dealing with the legacy systems, there's lots of frustration with formats, with you know, communicating with the owners of the legacy systems on how you should be able to integrate with them, and then building towards concepts. So on occasion, like legacy systems aren't necessarily documented well, and with the specific one we were trying to integrate with, it hasn't been touched for like 10-15 years. So when you're trying to integrate with these people, they don't even know like what certain fields mean, or what attributes are, or what's necessary.
And the people that built it might not even have worked there for a
Yeah,
long time.
exactly. So we had one, like, let's say, provider we were trying to integrate with, and the entire process of that was like just keep hammering them with varieties of responses so they could see how their system errors out, and they would kind of give us documentation based on how their system errored out, which is just not like the ideal way to be building software. It's kind of stressful, but also it can lead to poor decisions. But I think that the one thing I did learn from that role was that even though it might not feel like the right way, the fact that it's making the business move forward is so much more valuable, because that's going to give you so much capacity down the line to build the things that you do want to build.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
And what else, like in terms, it's like what I'm hearing here as well is it's like the technical challenges weren't really insurmountable. It sounded like the communication channels were the
mhm,
harder part of this. Multiple directions from, like you said, from the provider of the API,
yeah,
like the owners, with the local business teams and people involved in the project, and like actually, it's the classic thing with all software. You're kind of building a plane while you fly it.
right.
But you know what I mean, like knowing all of that now, like how would have you maybe managed all of that differently? Like if you at the time you were not in a management role, but had you sort of been in yourself in more of that kind of role, how would have you dealt with it?
Yeah. So one of the things I've learned how to do is set better expectations with my team. So it's essentially with my product teams or the owners, and saying like, look, like we can build this fast and we can do it. There's going to be a lot of maintenance down the line. There's going to be a lot of like unknowns, documentation issues, so on and so forth. What I've what I actually started learning as a lead is how to say no more often, or actually ask for better requirements, like forcing your product people to actually give you the requirements that you need to build out what they want, and also having them give you a clear idea of what an actual end product or the MVP really is, right?
Yeah.
Like being really candid and clear about what we want to build. That's very important. I found in that specific project, it's because we were discovering what we wanted to build as we were building it, that it ended up spiraling a bit more out of control than it could have. And even that, I'm saying out of control. Like, again, this is like, it's very nuanced. Like I'd say overall, the fact that we actually managed to build the software, regardless of how it was done, and the integration was completed, and that drove value to the company, that was pretty important. That was more important than some of the debt decisions that we did put on at the time, which I've heard from other developers who've worked on that system down the line, like a couple of years later, they're like, Rahim, what the fuck was wrong with you? And I'm like, that's just how the requirements were at that time. And as I've grown in software development, that's the thing I realized is we can say how we want things to work and we can have ideas on what will make it become the best thing. But the moment you start building is when all the problems start arising. Like you're going to run into shit all the time. So based on that, what I'm saying is like, as long as I can have a general understanding of what I want to build and where that line stops, I can build things better, or I can get into software more confidently.
Yeah, 100%. And that's kind of interesting. So, we're at this fintech company, you work on these integrations. Now, you mentioned some stuff there about being like a team lead. Did you actually did you work as a team lead at this organization, or is that something that emerged in later positions that you held?
In later positions. And again, so back to that specific role, and you had asked me like if I was the team lead, what would I have done to make that integration smoother? Like that's the one thing, is just ask for that documentation kind of stuff up front, and being more clear with your product people that we need requirements and we need to know what we're building in order to do so. But no, like during that period, I was, let's say, one of the developers on the team who had more experience with that domain because I'd been working on it for the long.
Nice.
Okay, I think we just got cut off. Fuck, man, I went on a tangent. What were you asking? Just remind me if I go off on a tangent. Just bring me back to the right question.
Yeah, no, you're all good. So yeah,
scrap that legacy question.
Bringing it back. So you're back at so you've been at this organization for a while. You're one of the more knowledgeable in this particular part of the code base and this sort of thing. That's all super cool. So that was kind of where you got the majority, front end, back end, got some like interesting experience with integrations. From that point, like once again, like what kind of inspired, like, you've moved on at some point, what kind of inspired your growth and, your decision to make some changes?
Totally. Yeah. So like that was one of the hardest decisions I actually made, was leaving that specific role. Being one of my first web development roles, it was extremely comfortable. I had friends in the company I was working with. I got along with my direct managers. It was a very hard decision to make. There was one thing that did drive it though. I had this idea that because I had an econ degree and there was this background in data analytics that I might have, that I should start focusing on that. And I also saw, like, every time I read Hacker News or whatever, it's like, this data analytic platform is blown up, this machine learning algorithm is becoming super popular, blah, 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 blah. Like that space just started growing, like data engineering, data science. Like we started hearing about it all the time. And it just happened to be that a recruiter reached out at a company that was working in that space, where big data was their product, or was a key part of their product, to say that. And once they reached out and I started analyzing like where I was at in my current role, I figured that I needed a breadth of experience. I'd gotten very good at this software, but I didn't think of myself as a decent software developer at all. Right? Like it gets hard. Like I don't know if I'm just building really well within this ecosystem, or whether I can actually succeed in any kind of project or problem that I'm given. So I took it on to myself as, number one, a challenge, number two, an opportunity to learn something new. And that's kind of what drove that change. Like that, plus from what I had heard about the company culture, was a really good fit for me. And especially because they were about to like ramp up. They were in that size where they were moving from the 10 to 12 developers to like the 30 developers. So I was part of that core team, not part of the core team, but just part of the transition into like them going into massive growth. And I figured that there would be a lot of opportunities for my career as well.
Nice. So And is that how it panned out? Like, so you've moved into this role, you've transitioned, you're testing yourself. Am I a one-hit wonder, or are my skills more universally applicable? What did you start to discover about yourself through this transition?
So first of all, that yes, my skills were transferable. Absolutely. Like that was the first thing, that like have a little bit more confidence in yourself. If you've been working on a software project for 2 years, you pick up things you don't even understand you're picking up, right? Like we're very good at that. So the first one was yes, like I could function and be productive and work well in a new dev team or a new dev environment. But was it everything I expected in the beginning? Absolutely not. And this is another problem when you set yourself up with an expectation that this is the entire, like I'm going to just be working on big data sets and that's me, that's what I am. That was just one facet of their entire software, right? Like that doesn't mean that that's what I as a new green team member are going to get to work on. Instead, I got to work on the very unsexy task of remonolithing, is what I'm going to call it, but essentially taking out other services and applications that the company had built and bringing them back into the monolith, right? So it was a very tedious challenge, but like a great way to learn about the software and what the kind of like nuances were, because you're kind of transferring over. So what we did was we wanted to bring in-house, they had software that was to run marketing campaigns, and it was being sold under its own brand and its own umbrella, but it heavily relied on a lot of data that the core application was using. And with the way this team had been building things out, they had just made a decision like, let's bring everything back into the monolith, reassess, and then decide if microservices are an actual thing, right? So part of that process was bringing in all of the APIs, bringing in all of the data models. Actually, I got the big data experience I wanted was actually, as we were migrating these things over, we decided we're going to rebuild all of the finance data collectors. So the data collectors that would go and grab financial and sales information for our users. And this stuff would come back with like 400 million records for our larger users, right? So we're talking about some pretty big databases. So I never actually got to start off working in big data like I thought, or even getting to work on the part of the application that I wanted to. But slowly, by bringing in this app, like this secondary app into the monolith, I got those opportunities just presented themselves. And what I had to do was be proactive about them. When I saw something that was going to be built out, because we knew what the roadmap was like, it was very clear. Like we're going to add this financial analytics UI and dashboards. So we're going to need all of this aggregation under the hood, and we're going to need all of this collection under the hood. And what I did was be proactive about that. I reached out to my manager. I said, this is something that I want to learn. I'm interested in improving my SQL skills. I'm interested in working with like bigger data sets. And I'd love to rebuild this finance collector because the legacy version of it kept causing the application to crash. So
did you guys just deal with like SQL there, or like I know when you start getting into big data, some NoSQL and document stores and other database engines start to become relevant? Because
very great question.
Yeah, I think across the board for most people, SQLs are the right choice, but at certain points, it becomes. I think a lot of people choose NoSQL for the wrong reasons. I want to say that more often than not, but it does have its place. Did you guys, when you got to it, did that become a thing for you?
The architecture of that is just fascinating, and the way it grew. Like I could talk about that for the rest of this chat. Like that's the problem.
Maybe when we do a more technical interview.
Yeah. So look, it was to start with, it was just all SQL. There were no SQL. There were no SQL databases, but for the other parts of the data aggregation. So like there was one part that was doing product research, and this was pulling in information about products that were being sold. In that domain, they were using some NoSQL DynamoDBs, and then like Elasticsearch on top of that to give you like sales estimate figures on.
And when you guys, did you ever get to touch any of those systems? Because it's been my experience that one of the issues when companies start or teams start working with NoSQL is they use all the patterns from what they understand from relational databases and like kind of end up with a crummy relational database instead of the advantages of a NoSQL database.
Yeah. So you kind of like you're kind of getting at it. Like it was a bit like that. Actually, we ran into one of the more common traps, which is you have like the core 2 or 3 developers that really know how that software works, right? and they've just been building in it so much that no one else wants to touch it. And like this happened in both my companies. And the previous company was an Elasticsearch service, right? You're probably familiar with this one, Aaron. Like in our fintech company, there's the Elasticsearch service that not that many people could work on because you can understand it. Similar thing with certain facets of this software, but I'll say for the most part, they did actually do things very well. Like this was one of the dev teams where, for the most part, I'd say like they made really sensible decisions and well-documented decisions. And like when we're talking about like now what I had to build and whether we were going to use a NoSQL database, I never actually got to be part of that initial decision. But what we ended up going with was a sharded database, right? Like it was a custom implementation called Citus. And for our use case, it worked really well because our aggregation was happening across one key. And the way it, like, that's how it would work. Like we were, because that one key, like the one sharding key that all the aggregation was happening within was like,
when you say key, it's not literally one key ID. It was one key was kind of like your primary key.
To that did you catch?
We cut off just at the one key or a primary key.
Yeah. Okay. So the one key or a primary key. Yeah. I'm like probably completely saying this wrong, but essentially with the Citus database, you provide a sharding key and you kind of like decide what table you're sharding off of us. So for us, this was an account, like a seller account, and all of the financial data associated to that specific seller account would live under that shard.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Right.
So something's interesting there, like, so we can probably riff on how these database models are forever, but I just kind of wanted to maybe talk about, it was good that you had the experience with that. But another thing you touched on there, I've been involved in projects of going from a monolith to a quote unquote microservices or service oriented architecture or whatever people want to refer to as, and then, bringing services back in. My current perspective on it is that it has, for many organizations that aren't at like FANG scale, like Google scale, Amazon scale, all these different organizations, whether that is the right architecture comes way more down to the team, their experience, their knowledge, and their ability to execute on a particular architecture than like actually being a solution for the business. It's like it's not like microservices versus monolith. It's like it's teams that can build microservices versus teams that build monolith, I think is the deciding factor on whether that is, that's has way more bigger impact on the whole.
And I think like also it comes down to sometimes teams don't understand the domains in which they should break out their microservices. They don't understand that like this database is actually required by more than one of these services. So like, why are you making it live in this specific project and then having like 6 or 7 other projects connect directly to that database? There's just like these weird architecture decisions that come up with microservices that if you haven't like really thought it through, you can end up in some really weird traps. And I've seen it happen at like pretty much every place I've worked. There's been some version of this. And also like the other thing that I realized with microservices is if you don't do them well, like each of your services needs to talk to each other. Like that's adding, and like each service that needs to talk to another service is another potential point of failure. And when you start like poorly planning microservices, you're adding so many different points of failure or potential points of failure that ends up being really tough to even debug simple problems sometimes, like if you haven't like really designed your system well.
Yeah, the like the operational sophistication from like a monitoring and alerts perspective is Absolutely. Like I often view that like the first step to any organization considering one of those architectures is they need to have like it's more starts at DevOps than it does at the developer level. Like developers like to initiate these projects, but if you haven't got the operational, like the DevOps kind of competencies in infrastructure internally, it's kind of like when you going back to when you were saying that the front end project you worked on, the person who built that had enough experience and knowledge to make some really sane choices that led to that being like such a pleasant thing to work on. And I think that the same thing would apply to, whether you're choosing a SQL, NoSQL data model, or if you're choosing monoliths versus microservices. If that founding team and people who instigate, I should say, that project, that's gonna like have way more impact on its success and problems that it ultimately solves than like the architectures themselves almost don't solve any problems if those places are in place.
No, and like this, like architects can come in and be like, we want all of these like crazy things to be built up, all right? Like at the end of the day, you're absolutely you nailed it. Like if you don't have a really solid DevOps team, or even like another thing is like really good integration testing between your applications, you're just asking for a world of pain.
Yeah, the way that I kind of view it with a lot of this stuff is like, if I had to broadly speak, what the yardstick for all of these decisions is what I put under the category of psychological safety, right, within a dev team. So if you design an operational system that has like really good disaster recovery, like getting the database back is really easy, and then all of a sudden you've eliminated the fear of the company losing their data. If you've set up a system that if someone releases some, pretty, buggy software, or they've done something that they can roll back within, like minutes, like those things create psychological safety. And I think that the same idea would be true even on the front end. It's like if you get the right build tools, the right component structure, the right folder structure, those things matter, right? And like as soon as everyone feels very comfortable and it's well documented, all of a sudden you've eliminated an entire category of anxiety from the team, which is like really the productivity win.
I agree.
Contributor that you're looking for.
And you know what, like those things make you move fast, like being able like having that comfort allows you to just move fast because like there's this hesitation to not break things and do things perfectly, but you can't necessarily move fast if you're always thinking in that way. So I like really like having good DevOps principles and like a good DevOps core, like kind of what you said. If I know that I can really easily undo what I did, and like the checks and balances are there where it's like it's just simple to do, like I personally feel like I can move way faster.
Nice. And I guess that brings us to your current position. So what initiated the transition from, working in this field of data that you believed was your holy grail of job satisfaction?
Totally. So yeah, actually with that role, like a few things happened. I got to do a little bit of data aggregation and stuff, but I got overly caught up into one of these data aggregators. Like I said, I was building out these aggregators to do financial reports of P&Ls, allowing people to like compare arbitrary periods of order and sales data to any period over their life cycle of ingested data. So it was really heavy. And it was my first time working on SQL and building out queries of that style. So, I made a lot of mistakes building out my first couple of iterations of data aggregators and caching services in order to display this stuff.
Caching's a really hard problem.
Yeah, but I took down like our production database once just because my
All right, I definitely want to dive into this because I think this is like probably one of the greatest fears of like probably not let alone like any junior developer, but any developer. Like maybe talk to me about like how did your organization because it's one thing for you to do it, but like there's a whole organizational impact that rolls out from that.
Yes. What was the company-wide impact on that for you?
Well, so actually not too bad. And again, this is because of what we had been talking about earlier. Having good DevOps means that you have psychological freedom to kind of break things and go back, or security, sorry, because what I was able to do is roll back the code really quickly. And to give you some perspective on what ended up happening.
But when you say roll back the code, though, but what about the database? Did you lose any data?
So the database didn't actually go down. What ended up happening was so my aggregation code, and here's the problem like about working fast sometimes, but we never had like a proper sandbox or staging environment just because the API we were connecting with, even though it was like sending these vast amount of data, they never provided a sandbox to actually test our assumptions. So what I did was I'd actually tested on staging with like 5 or 6 large accounts and tried the aggregation on there, and that chugged along smoothly. What we didn't realize was on our production system how the nodes were actually distributed. So we had some larger keys. So Amazon, so people who sell on Amazon have like accounts, and these accounts for our larger users were sharing the same node. So the aggregation would kick off and kind of tie up all the connections to the database because of that fact, because we had a couple of very, very large users. So this could have been mitigated by better testing environments. It could have been mitigated by like, doing something different rather than aggregating via connections, like creating like a queue and like in Redis or something, and then just slowly piecemeal aggregating them in. And that's actually what we ended up doing. That was my quick fix. So first we took down the production database because we tied up all of the connections to the database. So that took it out. How we fixed it was we had to flush our Redis queue, because that's like obviously in Ruby land, that's how you make background background jobs. So we flushed our Redis queue so that no background jobs were going and hitting the database. Then myself and another couple of teammates, we just did a quick patch of we still had value in tracking what data needed to be aggregated. We just didn't need to do it live. So instead, what we did was created a queue in Redis of keys that should be aggregated over time, stop the aggregation, and kind of recover it.
So the whole situation, the whole team was supportive. Like there wasn't finger pointing. It wasn't like, Rahim, you've taken, like, this is the worst thing you can do at the company. It sounds like you were really well supported. It sounds like everyone in the organization like rallied up, like knew that this was an unusual circumstances, could have happened to anyone. And, it took, some time to do that. At this, I mean, we kind of briefly touched on this earlier and I haven't come back to it, but were you a team lead at this point?
Yeah, no, it's not yet. So this is actually where I was like going with it. So, in that specific thing also, just by the way, like the reason there's also no blame is because we had a very strong culture of technical reviews. So getting senior people who were domain experts or specialists in that specific software or field had to look over anything that you were doing. So technical briefs, documentation, so on and so forth. So I had some pretty senior engineers, like very, very legit people looking over the SQL. And even in their perspective, like it seemed like it should have worked in the beginning. There were just some Postgres nuances, and especially with our Citus database, that weren't necessarily actually using indexes correctly. And this is all things that I got to learn, right? Like I never knew about how index paths were selected by a Postgres query and stuff, but I had to learn this really quickly. So anyways,
I think that's something that people maybe don't understand. Like, one of the buzzwords around the going in the field of, web development stuff is people talk about big data and data science and machine learning and AI and all these data related fields. And I think very few people are aware of how nuanced your understanding of database engines have to become to work with that. So yeah, there's all the cool outcomes that these AIs produce and all these things, but the storage and delivery and management of the data, like from like it forces you down an operations road. Like you're like, oh, I need to understand how databases work, how they're deployed, how they're maintained, how they like crash, how many connections can they make, all this stuff, which you wouldn't, when you're starting to learn about like, all this big data stuff, you didn't think you would have to be learning about how connection pooling for databases works.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like, that's kind of, it was both, it was both the hardest part and the most enjoyable part for me, right? Like learning or getting to touch tech that I'd never touched before, and being forced to actually understand it in a depth that I'd never looked at it before. Like that's what I've slowly started figuring out. That's what gives me life in software development. It's not necessarily like the building or the software that we build, but it's like that experience of learning something new or understanding a completely new system that I'm not familiar with. And that's kind of where the transition to where it's
how do you balance that against that? I think for many developers and many people in their career love that growth and the new things and the exciting new challenges, but there's also the reality that like much of the work that needs to be done can be repetitive, it can be tedious, it can be all these things that aren't like every day I'm like learning some crazy new thing about some crazy new technology. Is this something you try to like, like control the ratio of? Like how do you manage that balance?
So I'd say there's a few ways to do it. For me, what I found was like having a decent enough relationship with my manager and explaining to them the kinds of things that interest me or the things that I want to learn. So what I found is if you have a good manager and you're able to talk to them about these things, they will like slowly will come into your plate. It doesn't mean that you're always working on the things that you want to, but eventually if you've proven yourself and you've proven that you can take on challenges, I've found that if you're a bit proactive about what you want to work on, you're more likely to get it, right? Like rather than if you're just sitting back passively hoping that someone's going to give you that like next data engineering role and you're like, I'm not sure. I actually
And
found
have
that.
you had the like when you've like because that I find that to be very true, but I've also heard many stories of pushback where people are asking for opportunities to move into, and the organization may give lip service, bunch of things, but it's just never emerging. Have you been in that situation yourself?
Yeah. And that's kind of what led to me not necessarily wanting to like stay out my like stay much longer at that in the last role, right? So I had been kind of so I've had through my short dev career great managers, so managers. The so managers can actually impact how you're viewing like your actual contributions and stuff. I never realized externally that the contributions I was making to software were like being appreciated. People are actually like into what I was building, and I had some visibility in the company. I didn't know this, um, and I'm not gonna say I had a bad manager, but let's just say our styles never gelled 100%. So I don't like with regards to
And to that point, depending on the organization, do you think that not everyone that moves into a management role is given management training, and there's nothing about your technical skill set that necessarily equips you to be a good manager or
yeah,
understand what's involved in management. So there's definitely people that maybe you could call a so manager depending on their other soft skills like communication and temperament and any emotional insecurities that they're battling with. They're just their general humanness that they're dealing with. But would you say that these managers in reflection were maybe less had less suitable for the job, or had been given less support than they needed to be good at the job?
So that's that is a good question, and I'd say it's a bit of both, right? So with with our specific with the last role I was in, that company grew very quickly, and with that rapid growth there's growing pains. And I'm like not going to say the company had a bad culture of management. They actually had a very good culture of management and good managers, but the development team was one of those areas where growth was like very rapid, and it went from like a core team of a singular team to like specific groups of people work on specific problems to all of a sudden full-fledged, fully functioning product teams with managers and designers and stuff. The growth between it's just 5 or 10 developers to like 35 developers with devs in satellite offices around the world was very rapid in this company. And that's where like some of the gaps in, let's say, management training and stuff initially occurred. Once people like myself or other people are being more vocal about the pain points that they were feeling with higher ups and stuff, it got addressed, and we were more management training and stuff was being given out. So that's why I'm saying it's a bit of both. Like I do agree with you, like the that if there was probably better training on how to handle like even the wants and desires of your teammates to that manager in the beginning, we could have probably had a better relationship. But that definitely, like with the manager previous to this one, I had been able to kind of say like these are the problems that interest me, and they were being proactive about making sure that I wouldn't always get the things that I wanted to work on, but that there was things of interest that would eventually get scheduled onto my plate. And that's how I find software development. Like you don't always get to work on the interesting stuff. Sometimes it's the boring shit, but you need to sprinkle some of those things that give you joy within. Otherwise, you're gonna burn out or you're gonna not enjoy your role.
Did you feel that you hit some burnout at some points?
So yeah, I did, but not actually. I reached the burnout more when I started leading a team rather than when I was actually developing. So when I was developing, I started getting into a point of like now I'm bored with the software because I've worked in a lot of the areas. I understand how everything works. I need new opportunities. And in all honesty, this is why I'm saying being vocal about what you want is important, because I wasn't in the beginning, right? Like I wanted to go into data engineering, but I wasn't clear about that fact. I only talked to one manager briefly.
So you
And
weren't advocating for yourself.
no, I
And
wasn't.
did this lead you to, and I often find when people haven't sort of, developed, and that's a skill set. Advocating for yourself is a skill set. And if you haven't developed it, did you find that for you, you started to develop like resentments to management and the chain, or like how did this emotionally unfold for you? Because I think that sometimes a lot of friction can emerge from people not being shown how they can take ownership of their needs.
I never had the resentment because, man, like there's one thing I've been very fortunate about is choosing really good companies with good people to work with. I had like no problems with the actual core people, and like I worked with nice people. Like you know, they were genuinely humble, they cared, you know. I'd formed friendships. Like, you know, we'd been part of like the perks of my last job was going on these insane trips around the world. Like seriously, like we'd formed a fairly strong bond that I never had resentment for not getting the role. In fact, I actually was really happy for the people who did get that role, because I have this thing where maybe it's a complex, but I viewed that guy as a much more talented and stronger engineer than myself. So I was like, you know, for the company's sake, it's great that he's getting this role. I don't mind doing like more UI and like actually picking up more front end skills. But you're right. Like at the end of the day, the thing that I wanted to do, I didn't say that I wanted to do. And maybe that built in some like lightweight, not resentment, but like unhappiness in my role. Like more like, I don't think
Discontent.
that this is the thing that I want to be doing day to day. Maybe I could have done that other thing. But you know, like you can always say what if. There are always opportunities that always come up. So what I've learned is within my space, if I have a good relationship with my team and the people I'm working with, that's the most important. And understand what I'm working on, but also have some like leeway to build what I'm working on in a way that I think makes sense and is like more correct. And that's kind of where I was saying that so like after all of this stuff happened, I made it clear that I actually wanted to lead a team. It's something that I wanted to do. I don't know, like maybe I thought it'd be like the way to show that I've performed well in this industry. Like I want to lead a team.
Yeah, I
You know what I
think
mean?
there's a lot of people that view that like that's the step up, but I
Yeah.
don't think it's actually a step up,
No,
down, or even sideways is right. I think it's starting an entirely new career track.
absolutely.
And there's there's different, you don't realize that until you've done it.
And I knew that too. Like a lot of people, like yourself, I'd like talked to a lot of people in the dev community about like what it is to be a lead, and a lot of people had said the same thing. Like, do you like coding? Do you like the development process? If you do, like, it might not necessarily be the best fit for you, right? Like if you like to have hands-on keys all day and not be sitting in 100 meetings, like don't do the lead role. And but for me, like I needed to experience that. I needed to go through that whole process and see what worked and what didn't work for me.
And it's funny how you talked about because I haven't thought of it this way, how like in your lead role you experienced burnout, but in your technical roles you experienced boredom, which are
Yeah.
kind of, somewhat less than favorable outcomes, but they're very different experientially. It's one thing to be bored and maybe disengaged, which might lead, in the most severe outcome to apathy.
Yes.
But burnout is like a whole nother beast, because boredom at I've had boredom at my job, and that has never really led to the impact the other areas of my life the way that burnout does. Like burnout for me, when I've had this, has shown itself outside of the context of work. It's like when I'm burnt out, I'm burnt out more across the board,
Your
where
personal life struggle.
boredom and disinterest is much more siloed.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more. So and that's kind of the thing. So one of the decisions I made, like, COVID was a big driving factor into like how I got into the lead role, but also like how I reframed my mind to development. Uh, once I had nothing else to do and I just had work, it was actually kind of refreshing. I got to like love coding again. Right. I got to just even pick up like more mundane UI features and just building them all the way through. But I got into it again. And that was just because I think like even with that specific industry, we started growing really fast again, and there was opportunities to build more product. And I then really expressed my interest to become a lead. So I kind of like expressed it earlier on, but there weren't any opportunities. And then kind of at this time when COVID hit again, the opportunity just opened up. And I was offered a lead role. And I just decided like it was kind of a strange time. I wasn't certain if I wanted to continue on at the company by this point, because I'd been there for a couple of years, and I was starting to reach that boredom phase. And for me, that boredom phase, I would hate for it to lead to apathy, especially with a team that I respect. Like I never want to be the person who's not contributing to a team that I work on. So I then got offered the lead role, and in all honesty, I think it was the best idea to actually take it and learn from it, because I've had more respect for anyone that's led a team that I've been on after being a lead.
Do you find that also now that you've been a lead, so you're not a lead currently in your new role?
No.
You're back to develop, more focused on development. Do you find now that you've having been a lead, as a developer, you're better at collaborating and working with your lead? Like you kind of know what things to bring to their attention. You know what they're looking for. Like you understand like the little things that are really nothing extra to you that supports them in insanely, effective and valued ways.
So, and this is like what it comes down to. Like my leaving the lead role was okay. So I said leaving my fintech role was hard. Leaving this lead role was so hard. Honestly, it was one of the toughest decisions I had to
And
make.
is this because of how you felt about the people that you led and your
Oh,
responsibility to
absolutely.
them?
Yeah, yeah. It was a few factors. So I had an amazing relationship with my product manager, like fantastic guy. My direct manager was amazing, like cared about my actual career growth, has cared about my career growth more than like a lot of people. And this is why I said, like, maybe if I'd had that manager a little bit earlier on, I would have actually stuck onto that role for a couple of years more. And I think someone mentioned this, like good managers can actually make or break like your entire experience at a company. So I had a great manager, a great product manager that I was working with. My team was extremely supported and some of the most talented guys in that company, like 10xers almost. And we were actually doing very well as a team. So the team that I got picked to lead was one of the teams at this company that has had like a lot of, not turnover, but kind of yeah, I'd say like turnover in its leadership or its vision and its delivery. And this was the membership team. And it's because its stakeholders were like, the finance and marketing teams. So you have like very tight deadlines, shifting requirements. Your stakeholders are like pretty key components of the company. You're dealing with money. If you fuck up, like that's revenue lost. So there was a lot of pressure, like leading that team. But I think we did a really, really good job over the first, over the months that I did actually take on. But working at that pace, picking up a new role, getting into more people management and stuff, like I found that it did take a lot of my mental bandwidth. I started working overtime almost daily. I was in meetings all day long. I'd wake up at 8 o'clock. First thing, sorry, 8 o'clock. I wake up at 6 o'clock. The first thing I'm doing is checking my phone for Slack messages because we'd have a 2 hour difference between myself and my product manager. So I'd have messages like before I've even started my workday. And I got into like a really bad habit of not separating from work. As a developer, I was able to do that. I was able to draw boundaries really well. As a lead, like those boundaries, keeping them up would actually impact me as a people manager, I felt. So I let that role seep into my personal life. And I think that's what started causing the burnout. Like I started overthinking it, overworking into it. And it ended up being because like I've experienced like poor management from my side and I never wanted that to happen with the people I was working with. So I was like overly focused on what they were doing or whether their career goals were developing in that way. And I never thought about things from this perspective before. It was just the code, not like how the people are functioning and all the people management skills. Like that had never been part of my role ever. So
Yeah.
like learning all of that and getting into all of that, I am so proud to have had that experience and so happy and glad that they gave me that experience. But it definitely did start taking its toll, and I think it was one of the reasons I decided like I wanted to move on. From a technical perspective, I'd stopped like the learning had kind of stopped, and there were certain aspects of the management that I wasn't enjoying. But that being said, there are certain aspects of management that I loved, and that's the strategizing, the high level thinking, and being able to talk directly to stakeholders and say yes or no, we can't complete this because of XYZ reason. Like having those discussions is so fulfilling for me personally. And what I started to gauge though was when you work in smaller development teams, it doesn't matter if you're the lead or not, you get to have those kinds of discussions and you get to think in that way. And that's kind of what fueled my like my shift to the next role and moving away was that idea. I wanted to work with smaller teams again.
Nice, nice. So that's kind of leads us to your current job, which I believe you haven't been at too long. So maybe you don't have any like insane thoughts or insights that you've gathered yet, but maybe looking back, you know, and if it maybe as part of your looking back at all the journey that we've kind of just covered, what do you think provided the most difficult challenge for you?
I will say it was the lead role, is like the people management side of it. And that's because you're kind of balancing trying to deliver something from a technical vision and letting go of that a little bit too. So you're like a high level planning, but you don't want to be too involved. You want your team to be able to handle most of the technical decision making, but also being able to provide them like the feeling of career growth or career development, finding out what they're interested in, trying to get your team engaged, trying to get them focused on the right problems, trying to give them a variety of problems. Like I found I got so caught up into um, that it was finding like a balance to actually get my technical development up there. And that was a struggle, right? Like it's like
do you find you were getting rusty with your technical skills that for the
a little bit
that you were in your
like to an extent I tightened up some other skills, right? I became a really good support player for the team, so I do day-to-day bug fixes, anything that I could work on independently from blocking the team I would pick up. So definitely I never got to work on like more technically challenging problems from like the actual implementation level. High level, yes. So I got to do a lot of high level strategizing and stuff, which was fun. Like that was a technical aspect that I really enjoy. And I think, like I'd mentioned before, you get to do that a lot more with smaller teams. So I got to do a bit of that side, and that was fun. But in my day-to-day coding and getting faster with that, and like just producing like a factory line churning out features, that I definitely got a bit rustier at and had to like refocus my mind and retrain all of those skills again, because the people management side does take up a significant amount of time. And especially if you want to be, like, in my opinion, a good lead, like someone that actually motivates your team and enhances them or multiplies like their productivity, you really need to focus on what like drives your team's happiness, right? Like having a team that's unsatisfied or apathetic or dejected or not happy with the software means that you're never going to perform well. You're never going to deliver what you set out to. And I'm just very lucky that I had not only a talented team, but like, a fairly easygoing team too. They helped support me quite a bit through becoming a lead.
Yeah, I can totally see with that. I've, walked the spectrum, and not having that easygoing nature or receptivity and openness, like working with, I've definitely worked on teams where some team members are much more, from my perspective, difficult. Maybe from their perspective, I was being difficult. So I don't really think it's necessarily fair for me to claim the quality of their character and workmanship, but it definitely, maybe if you boil it down to, is if the team members are finding it hard to get along, it really shows.
Yeah. And like, I've experienced that, like poor team dynamics. And sometimes it really, really is. It just comes down to miscommunication. And if you're a lead, like that's the kind of stuff you really need to spot. I remember, with one of my teammates, we just had different expectations about each other's levels and like what our relationships to each other were in that environment. And our lead never actually just sat us down and had this discussion like, hey, Rahim, you're the domain expert in this. You should really be training this guy into this space. I just viewed him as like a senior developer who'd be able to like ramp up really quickly, right? But that the lead never set that expectation, and that caused friction in that specific environment. And that's why I'm like, when I took on that role, I was like hyper focused on the people and making sure that those kinds of dynamics were smooth. And maybe that's what, like, me overly focusing on that probably led to some of my burnout. But I always want to be part of like a high performing team. Like that's a really important thing for me. And if you're a lead in that capacity, it can be like mentally consuming.
How did you end up resolving your burnout, or did you end up resolving it?
Yeah, so a few aspects, like, and this is where I am like giving full kudos to that last company. And like I'm saying, their pain points. Sometimes I feel like we bring the pain into our own roles by just not communicating effectively. I talked about the burnout with my managers and stuff, and they gave me breaks. Like they gave me, longer periods to just go and rest and recharge. And it was like really, I think COVID played a big part into feeling that burnout. Like it was external and internal. All of those releases, like where you just spent like a full day slogging it, and you can't just go outside and enjoy hanging with your friends. Like there was just no de-stressors. You're like in the work environment the whole time.
Yeah, there's no pressure release valve. It's just kind of all
Yeah,
built up.
exactly. And so like the company was really good at giving me the space to kind of get out of the burnout, but at the same time the company was also at like a very rapid growth phase, and my team specifically had a lot of work on its plate. So let's say I would take time off to go and relax on the burnout, like that doesn't mean that all of my roles and responsibilities just magically go away. All of those meetings are still carrying on in the background, and when I get back I have like triple or quadruple the workload, right? So um and I'll say like that was something that I also found was really good about the last company was managers took feedback very seriously. So I mentioned that to my manager. I'm like, I feel burnt out by the time I come back. They created an entire process around this where you could hand off your lead responsibilities for a week and someone else would manage them. They would literally like take care of everything and write you a summary of like, this is what I did for leading the
That's
week.
amazing.
And I'm like,
I've never really heard of that, that like they took it that seriously, that they devised a way that, and which this makes sense even for vacation. Like if you want to go away for a week or two, someone has to pick up that gap. So it's like that solves so many problems. But I'm sure there are organizations that do this, but to be quite honest, that's the first time I've heard of it. And,
and that's why
that's amazing.
And that's why I said it was like very tough for me to leave that last role, because that was my direct manager. I told her, I was like, look, like this, I feel burnout every time I come back. Within a day, she had a template ready on how we could do handoffs for
That's
like
phenomenal.
and 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 that kind of leads me to what ended up like going towards this next role was I didn't want to, like I said, I like being part of a high performing team. I also like to be a high performer, and I never want to be a person who gets into that state where I'm just like happy, well, not happy, but like kind of don't have my foot on the gas, or I'm just kind of like easing out and not working as hard.
You
Or
don't want to rest on your laurels. You know,
yeah,
you find comfort in the discomfort.
yeah, and I started realizing like what I don't want to be a hindrance to my team because I respect them too much, and I started feeling like I was borderlining towards becoming apathetic again, I've been battling with that feeling like in cycles with this company. And this company was fantastic because what they would do is like you're it was a fast growing team, so you don't necessarily get to work on what's fun, but then you have these amazing trips where you get to just interact with all the people that you've worked with remotely, and that recharges you, and you get into that mindset again, and you're like 6 more months, and then you go on another trip, and then 6 more months. And
I've definitely experienced the value of getting to know more about someone outside the context of their work, and it really can lift a lot of friction, because I think a lot of unnecessary maybe bitterness or resentment that I held against some of my co-workers throughout my career stemmed from the fact that I only knew them through like pull requests and things like that. Like I never got to see every aspect. And then when that finally happened to me, that I got to build relationships much more deeply and broadly outside of the work that was just being delivered, it's like it made everything so much easier to work on and collaborate. Like the communication flow, raising certain things, different perspective on things were easier to discuss. And just like that's a really great strategy, I think, that you're describing there, that this organization has used, because I think it's so easy for, especially on small teams with founders that are new, to just to not realize how much, like, you need to know the most, not most, but like you need to know the many facets of a person, not just what they do technically in their role.
Absolutely. And like, so with that company, and that's again why I said like it was a really hard decision to leave, but I started realizing that it was just the time. Like the fact, like for me, it's like when I think about moving on, once that might just be because I'm not comfortable in my current role and I need to work through it some more. But when that thought starts recurring over a few months, like I thought it was time to reassess. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was go back to learning. And one of the languages that I'd been really interested in learning was Golang. I've been, kind of implementing it in tools here and there throughout my dev career and trying to get it introduced. But, I'd never gotten to work on it in production systems. And it was just something that like I've been wanting to learn and get more experience with. So I decided that if I'm looking on for new opportunities, that's going to be like one of the key things I'm looking for, is a space in which I can work in that specific tech stack. It's kind of weird. Like, I don't advocate for going to work in a place because of a tech stack. And that's not why I chose it. It's just like, I kind of,
but it's like, even if that's not your, it's like, it's fine to have several items that you want ticked off, and say, obviously it may not be, you may not think it's the first item to tick, because it's, judging from your experience, the first item you want to tick is like, the kind of culture in the team and the people that you're going to work with is like, no tech stack's going to, overcome that. But, given that, if you there can be many options for that. Like, there's a lot of companies trying to be great places to work. And then the next question becomes like, of this list of companies that I've figured out that are great to work at, what are solving are they in a space that I have interest? And then B, are they using tools that what do you know what I mean? I think that's fine to have all of those lists. And as you get further through your career, I think you have more opportunities to tick more of those boxes on a list than maybe you do in the earlier parts of your career.
Exactly. And also, like, for me, it's so you kind of nailed it. It's like the company, the culture, team size is like one of the things I'm also starting to realize is a factor for me. Smaller dev teams, like I know that my dev team's eventually going to grow and stuff, but at this specific point, when you're at that under 10 or around that 10 mark of developers, like, you can just wear so many hats. You can work on so many different parts of the software that as the team scales out and gets bigger, it just doesn't make sense for you to work in that way. And for me, I started missing that. Like, I got to do it in the last role in the fintech company. I got to do that. I got to wear a lot of hats, even though I was fairly junior. Within my last role in the beginning, like the first year, I got to do a lot of that too. And I found that gives me a lot of drive to keep wanting to develop and to keep learning. It's getting to work on a variety of things. So, database problems, UI issues, building bots here and there, like, helping with the pipelines on the DevOps system. It just gives me a breadth of experience that I enjoy. Now, with my current role, the other thing, so like, it was the team size, the language stack, getting to chat with, like, the technical people on that team and finding how passionate they are about the software, or like even how they think of the software in general. Like, over my 1 week of just being here, I can see that it's like a labor of love, like the software, like people are actually, putting effort into making sure it's good. And not only that, like, there's the opportunity to be more proactive when you have a team of this size, right? Like, you have more power to dictate what kinds of features get built out or how they get built out when you're at this size.
Just a substantially more autonomy, basically.
Yeah. And then the last and most key factor for me is the industry. Like, one of my favorite things about being a software developer is not actually necessarily been the software development. It's being able to be transplanted into absolutely any industry and being able to like get going. Like, like, now I've managed in my very short career as a software developer to work in gaming, fintech, e-com/big data, and now the music industry. Like, it's fascinating that you can work in all of these spaces. There are very few roles or jobs where you're able to change at that speed the industry in which you're in. And like the whole kind of view that people have of developers has changed so much. Like, people were so excited to talk to me when I joined this company because they're seeing ways in which we can help improve their workflows. Like, I had a guy like tell me, he's like, man, we want to increase our engagement in this chat or whatever. Like, could you help us build a bot that does X, Y, Z? And people are really starting to think in this way. Like, they're starting to think in like, what way can this developer like make my life super easy.
Well, I think what it is, and this is like something that more broadly how people view tech in general is, I think there's actually way less tech companies than people realize, but there's many, many tech enabled companies. And I think most businesses are realizing that, like, you know, there's opportunities to be tech enabled for almost every business, and it's a huge competitive advantage.
Exactly.
But anyway, just we're getting towards the end here, and I kind of want to wrap up with my final question. If you could go back in time and talk to your past self just after you graduated from a boot camp, what advice would you give yourself?
That's a very good question. And so I'd say a few things, like live your experiences, like enjoy them, actually get what you're learning, like figure out what you're learning when you're building software. Like you know, what I found is that there were so many projects that I thought were useless to me in the long run, but taught me a lot about software development and just even how to like build reusable slash scalable code. The second thing is communicating, like communicate well with your team. You know, like I was really shy of doing pull requests or like even commenting in pull requests because of that imposter syndrome. Like I didn't think that I had anything of value to give uh like to the code base. But doing those exercises, like involving yourself in the development process and being really as proactive as you can be over time, you're just going to start realizing that you're picking up skills that you never knew you even had. uh like it's become, you know, really humbling when I get to a point where someone's like, what have you worked on, and I have a list of things that I've worked on that like it just doesn't like compute to me that I've actually managed to work on this much software over my time in this career. um so those are a couple things. The third thing, and I think I used to do it a lot more when I was more of like a junior, was taking time outside of my work to like just explore technology, you know, um, learning about frameworks that aren't what you're currently working in, learning about new pieces of tech. Like, you know, it it sounds really like a basic and obvious thing, but it's such an important skill to have, because as companies grow and scale, they start looking for those avenues and those opportunities. Like, where can we improve our software? What new you know, mechanisms can we add in? And if you're on the pulse of what's like what's popular, what's happening, what's new and exciting, you can eventually kind of like help put that into your company's software. And like a really good example of this was, you know, something like data lakes, right? It's just becoming a very important, like it's becoming a big area in like big data management, like creating large lakes of S3 buckets and stuff. You know, if we never had developers who were researching and looking outwards towards new technology at my last role, we would have never implemented that. And it was such a cool project. Like people are getting to work on like cutting edge technology because they're being proactive about it. And I think that's really important.
Nice. All right. Yeah, that's I totally resonate with that. It's something that's been a thing that I've done throughout my career and has opened many, many doors. So yeah, I completely agree with you there. Anyway, it's been amazing. Thank you very much for today and your patience through the many technical difficulties that we've had. It's been awesome. And yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron. And I hope this somewhat clips together well once you edit
Awesome.
it. All right. Have a great one, man.
Yeah.
Cheers.